Hello, hello. Oh, hello, hello, hello. Okay, here we are on ongoing teaching. Say their name square. Day 6. Day 6. Book 6. Rise of the Warrior Cop. The militarization of America's police force by Radley Balko. The introduction. There are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. James Madison. Are cops constitutional? That may seem like an odd question, perhaps even a little nutty. Police forces have been a part of the American criminal justice system since an 8-man department was established in Boston 175 years ago. And the first large department was created 7 years later in New York City. There has never been a serious constitutional challenge to the general authority of police or to the establishment of police forces, sheriff's departments, or other law enforcement agencies. And it's unlikely there ever will be. Any federal court would undoubtedly have little patience for such a challenge, and any hypothetical world where police were ruled unconstitutional would descend into chaos probably rather quickly. But in a 2001 article for the Seton Hall Constitutional Law Journal, the legal scholar and civil liberties activist Roger Roots posed just that question. Roots, a fairly radical libertarian, believes that the U.S. Constitution does not allow for police as they exist today. At the very least, he argues, police departments' powers and practices today violate the document's spirit and intent. Under the criminal justice model known to the framers, professional police officers were unknown, Roots writes. The general public had broad law enforcement powers, and only the executive functions of the law, for example, the execution of writs, warrants, and orders, were performed by constables or sheriff, who might call upon the community for assistance. Initiation and investigation of criminal cases was nearly the exclusive province of private persons. The advent of modern policing has greatly altered the balance of power between the citizen and the state in a way that would have been seen as constitutionally invalid by the founders. Root's argument may not be practical, but is certainly provocative. On at least one point, most criminologists agree with him. No one can say for sure whether the founders would have approved of modern policing, but it's relatively certain that they wouldn't have recognized it. Criminologist and historian Samuel Walker writes in his book, Popular Justice, that in colonial America, most of the modern institutions of today's criminal justice system, the uniformed police, prisons, probation, parole, did not exist at all. The colonies did have appointed sheriffs and constables, and some also had marshals. But the duties associated with those jobs were largely administrative. Most were not salaried positions. Instead, they received fees for tasks like serving subpoenas and collecting taxes. Since there were no fees associated with enforcing the criminal laws, for most sheriffs and constables, that task was a low priority. Sheriffs did oversee the jails, but the jails were primarily used to hold defendants until trial. Incarceration as punishment was rare. Law enforcement in the 18th century was mostly a private affair. Community mores, social stigma, and shaming were the most important ways of maintaining order. Crime victims could bring their complaints to a jury, a panel of private citizens who had the power to indict, but the victim or his proxy was the party to initiate the charges. Professional, full-time prosecutors didn't exist. Under this system, enforcement of the law was a universal duty. Every male citizen had a civic responsibility to serve on a watch, act as a constable, serve on a grand jury, or join a posse when necessary to apprehend a dangerous criminal. The word police wasn't used as a noun. It was a verb meaning to watch over or monitor the public health and safety. This isn't to say that the colonial era more individualized private methods of law enforcement would work today. As American towns grew from close-knit communities of people of similar ethnicities with shared traditions, values, and religion to cities whose diverse populations of immigrants had none of that in common, centralized police forces emerged to preserve order and enforce a common set of laws. Once neighbors stopped speaking the same language and worshiping in the same buildings, shunning and social stigmatization lost their effectiveness. Now, whenever I hear that order, law and order, or preserve the order, I think white supremacy. So, emerge to preserve order. That because of the different ethnicities, they're wanting to preserve white supremacy, in my view. Even so, Root's question is a useful starting point for this book because it shows just how far we have come. The founders and their contemporaries would probably have seen even the early 19th century police forces as a standing army, and a particularly odious one at that. Just before the American Revolution, it wasn't the stationing of British troops in the colonies that irked patriots in Boston and Virginia. It was England's decision to use the troops for everyday law enforcement. The wariness of standing armies was born of experience and a study of history. Early American statesmen like Madison, Washington, and Adams were well versed in the history of such armies in Europe, especially in ancient Rome. If even the earliest attempts at centralized police forces would have alarmed the founders, today's policing would have terrified them. Today, in America, SWAT teams violently smash into private homes more than 100 times per day. The vast majority of these raids are to enforce laws against consensual crimes. In many cities, police departments have given up the traditional blue uniforms for battle dress uniforms modeled after soldier attire. Police departments across the country now sport armored personnel carriers designed for use on a battlefield. Some have helicopters, tanks, and Humvees. They carry military-grade weapons. Most of this equipment comes from the military itself. Many SWAT teams today are trained by current and former personnel from Special Forces units like the Navy SEALs or Army Rangers. National Guard helicopters now routinely swoop through rural areas in search of pot plants, and when they find something, send gun-toting troops dressed for battle, rappelling down to chop and confiscate the contraband. But it isn't just drugs. Aggressive SWAT-style tactics are now used to raid neighborhood poker games, doctors' offices, bars, and restaurants, and head shops, despite the fact that the targets of these raids pose little threat to anyone. This sort of force was once reserved as the best option to defuse a dangerous situation. It's increasingly used as the first option to apprehend people who aren't dangerous at all. There's now a dominant military culture within modern police agencies. Go to one of the many SWAT conferences and SWAT team competitions held throughout the year, and you'll find exhibit halls teeming with military weapons, gear, clothing, and imagery. The vendors at these events know their market. They use war imagery to ply their goods because that's what makes cops and police departments want to buy them. Many sell the same products to both the military and civilian police agencies. In the 1990s and 2000s, the company Heckler and Koch marketed its MP5 semi-automatic weapon with the slogan, "From the Gulf War to the Drug War, battle proven." Publications like Larry Flint's SWAT magazine featured ads that emphasize knocking heads and kicking ass, and print articles with headlines like "Go for the Throat" and "Warrior Mindset." There's been nothing secretive about this transformation, but because it's been unfolding over several decades, we don't seem to have noticed. On February 11, 2010, in Columbia, Missouri, the police department SWAT team served a drug warrant at the home of Jonathan Whitworth, his wife, and their 7-year-old son. Police claimed that 8 days earlier they had received a tip from a confidential informant that Whitworth had a large supply of marijuana in his home. Oh no! They then conducted a trash pull, which turned up marijuana residue in the family's garbage. That was the basis for a violent nighttime forced entry raid on the couple's home. The cops stormed in, screaming, swearing, and firing their weapons, and within seconds of breaking down the door, they intentionally shot and killed one of the family's dogs, a pit bull. At least one bullet ricocheted and struck the family's pet corgi. The wounded dogs whimpered in agony. Upon learning that the police had killed one of his pets, Whitworth burst into tears. The Columbia Police Department SWAT team recorded many of its drug raids for training purposes, including this one. After battling with the police over its release, a local newspaper was finally able to get the video through state open records laws and posted it to the internet. It quickly went viral, climbing to over 1 million YouTube views within a week. People were outraged. The Columbia Police Department was swamped with phone calls and emails, and its officers were condemned, cursed, and scolded. Some even received death threats. The video also made national headlines. On Fox News, Bill O'Reilly discussed it with newspaper columnist and pundit Charles Krauthammer, who assured O'Reilly's audience that botched raids like the one in the video were unusual. He warned viewers not to judge the war on drugs based on the images coming out of Columbia. Krauthammer was wrong. This was not a botched raid. In fact, the only thing unusual about the raid was that it was recorded. Everything else, from the relatively little evidence to the lack of a corroborating investigation, the killing of the dog, the fact that the raid was for nothing more than pot, the police misfiring, and their unawareness that a child was in the home, was fairly standard. The police raided the house they intended to raid, and they even found some pot. The problem for them was that possession of small amounts of pot in Colombia had been decriminalized. They did charge Whitworth with possession of drug paraphernalia for the pipe they found near the marijuana, a $300 fine. The reaction to the video was fascinating and perhaps encouraging because, again, the raid itself was indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of similar raids conducted each year in America. It was as if the country, or at least the internet generation, was for the first time seeing firsthand, on-the-ground footage of the way the drug war is fought every day, and they found it terrifying. Most Americans still believe we live in a free society and reverse its core principles. No, okay, I'm starting over there. Most Americans still believe we live in a free society and revere its core values. These principles are pretty well known: freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to a fair trial, representative democracy, equality before the law, and so on. These aren't principles we hold sacred because they're enshrined in the Constitution or because they were cherished by the founders. These principles were enshrined in the Constitution and cherished by the framers precisely because they're indispensable to a free society. This book answers the question, how did we get here? How did we evolve from a country whose founding statesmen were adamant about the dangers of arms standing government forces, a country that enshrined the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights and revered and protected the age-old notion that the home is a place of privacy and sanctuary, to a country where it has become acceptable for armed government agents dressed in battle garb to storm private homes in the middle of the night, not to apprehend violent fugitives or thwart terrorist attacks, but to enforce laws against non-violent consensual activities. How did a country pushed into a revolution by protest and political speech become where protests are met with flash grenades, pepper spray, and platoons of riot teams dressed like RoboCops? How did we go from a system in which laws were enforced by the citizens, often with non-coercive methods, to one in which order is preserved by armed government agents, too often conditioned to see streets and neighborhoods as battlefields and the citizens they serve as the enemy? Before we begin, a few organizational notes are in order. First, this is not an anti-cop book. Although it includes plenty of anecdotes about bad cops, there are plenty of good cops. Boo! Some of them are interviewed in this book. The fact is that we need cops. Oh boy. And there are limited situations in which we need SWAT teams. If anything, this is an anti-politician book. Bad cops are the product of bad policy, and policy is ultimately made by politicians. A bad system loaded with bad incentives will unfailingly produce bad cops. The good ones will never enter the field in the first place, or they will become frustrated and leave police work, or they'll simply turn bad. Yeah. A good cop quits, is one of my sayings. At best, they'll have unrewarding, unfulfilling jobs. This book explores the consequences of having cops who are too angry and too eager to kick down doors and who approach their jobs with entirely the wrong mindset, but with an eye towards identifying and changing the policies that allow such people to become cops in the first place and allow them to flourish in police work. Second, some of the book is the product of historical research, some of it is original reporting done exclusively for the book, and some of it is original reporting I've done for other publications. Many of the passages taken from reported pieces I've already published are reprinted here verbatim or nearly verbatim. Finally, many of the anecdotes mentioned in the book happened years or decades ago. Sometimes there was a flurry of initial coverage of an incident, but then no coverage of the resolution. I've tried to find out how all of these incidents were resolved, but that wasn't always possible. For example, an anecdote may have come from a complaint in a lawsuit against a police department that was resolved with a closed settlement, which means the police account of the incident was never revealed, or a police department may have refused to disclose information about an internal investigation, leaving only press accounts of an incident. In cases like these, I've indicated the source of the accusation to let you know that they're one-sided narratives. This story of police militarization in America begins with lessons from ancient Rome, then moves quickly through the Dark and Middle Ages into the origins of modern policing. We examine the foundations of the American experiment laid down during the colonial period and the American Revolution, the right to privacy, the Castle Doctrine, and the demilitarization of free societies. Then look at the emergence of the modern centralized police department in the early 19th century. After quickly passing through the Progressive era, the professionalization movement, and alcohol prohibition, we come to the real beginning of the story of modern police militarization. The social upheaval, civil unrest, and culture wars of the 1960s. At that point, the book becomes a more focused narrative. We follow the militarization trend through Nixon's rhetorical wars on crime and drugs in the 1970s and Reagan's all-too-literal drug war of the 1980s, and the massive expansion of SWAT teams, the proliferation of military gear, and the federalization of policing in the 1990s. The final chronological chapter looks at how the war on terrorism has accelerated the militarization of the police, how SWAT teams and the paramilitary approach to policing have moved beyond the wars on drugs and terror, and how frighteningly willing the government has become to use this sort of force to make a political statement. The book ends with a chapter on reforms and recommendations on how to roll back the militarization of policing in America and whether any meaningful reform is still possible. Well, he didn't start out good for me. He's telling me there's good cops, and that this isn't an anti-cop book. Says it's not an anti-cop book, but then goes through about how all good cops quit and that they have unfulfilling jobs. Chapter 1. Uh-oh. Got some foreign language. I won't try to pronounce the foreign language part. Who will watch the watchers? Juvenal, first century Roman poet. Given that most of the American founders were students of the Enlightenment and its revival of classical learning, most of them looked fondly on the Roman Republic and drew lessons from the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, for example, wrote the Federalist Papers under the pen name Publius in honor of the first consul of the Roman Republic, and one of the revolutionaries who overthrew the monarchy. James Adams, in particular, was a fan of Cicero, who spent much of his public life warning of the dangers of militarism and dictatorship, and was eventually murdered for it. The American forefathers were keenly aware of the price that Rome paid by permitting the military to gain such power in their society, and they generally sought to avoid its mistakes. It seems fitting, then, that the world's first documented organized police force would have been established in ancient Rome, and the rise of that ancient police force raised many of the same questions about balancing security with liberty that we debate today. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Rome fell into chaos as the empire's powerful factions maneuvered to seize power. Anticipating bloodshed, faction leaders began to pull elite troops from their armies to serve as bodyguards. These guard units came to be called Praetorian cohorts, after the Praetorian cohors who guarded the tents of Roman generals during war. By the end of the reign of Emperor Augustus, and for the next several centuries, the Praetorian Guard would take on more of the roles we now associate with a conventional police force, including investigating serious crimes, making arrests, providing security during Colosseum games, collecting taxes, spying on suspected revolutionaries, collecting undercover intelligence, and even fighting fires. During his reign, Augustus established two other policing forces less prestigious than the Praetorians. Around 13 BC, he created the cohorts urbanae, or urban cohorts, which he charged with quelling riots and keeping order in the streets. And in AD 6, he created an additional order called the Vigiles. First charged exclusively with fighting fires, the Vigiles would also later take on police duties and came to serve as Rome's night watchmen. Augustus's Praetorian Guard would eventually become one of the most powerful institutions in Rome. In later years, the Guard's loyalty often determined who would become the next emperor, and its members may have assassinated as many as a dozen Roman emperors and many more potential heirs. The interesting thing about Augustus's first police forces is that to implement them he had to navigate some of the same challenges and objections to civic policing that arise today. He had to balance public safety and the maintenance of order by at least appearing to respect civil liberties. More importantly, he had to find ways to assure the Senate and the citizenry that the responsibilities of these bands of order-keeping public servants, all drawn from the Roman army, were distinct from the duties that Romans normally associated with soldiers. Even in ancient Rome, the public was acutely sensitive to the threat of militarized policing. Prior to Caesar's march on Rome in 49 BC, soldiers were forbidden to enter the capital as soldiers. There had never been a permanent standing army within the city. It was Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, the city's outer boundary, with his army that triggered the civil war that ended the Republic. After Augustus, the Praetorian Guard became an increasingly powerful force in the upper echelons of Roman power. As conquest and empire became central tenets of Roman society, the day-to-day lives of Romans became infused with militarism. Soldiers and generals began to be held in higher esteem than scholars and statesmen. The Praetorian Guard grew its consignment under Augustus to civilian policing and was reconnected with the Roman army. Eventually, the Guard directly interfered with the succession of emperors, sowing further instability. The Praetorian Guard was finally disbanded by Emperor Constantine in AD 312. Its members had made the mistake of backing his opponent. About 1,800 years would pass before the world would see another metropolitan police force as centralized and organized as those that Augustus first established in Rome. There are also some broader parallels between Rome and the establishment of policing in the modern world. During the Roman Republic, disputes were settled between and within families. Criminals were often punished by their own relatives, who faced social pressures to make right by victims and their kin. But under Augustus, private and provincial affairs, as Rome was transferred from republic to empire, dispute resolution, punishment, and remuneration. I would think that's remuneration, and it's spelled wrong. Remuneration, which had once been handled privately, fell exclusively to the emperor's executive power. As we will see, Britain and the early United States went through a similar transition centuries later. In the United States, the colonial era concerns about standing armies gave way to more immediate problems like crime and rioting as the country moved into the industrial age. Cities turned to centralized power, police agencies reporting to the mayor to impose law and order. In the years that followed Rome's fall, organized policing largely disappeared from Rome. One exception were the few cities in Italy that became hubs of trade and culture. As they grew, cities like Florence and Venice had to contend with urban issues of crime, poverty, and disease. To keep order, which kept the trade flowing, leaders established patrols to protect the property of businesses, tradesmen, and manufacturers, and to enforce curfews during outbreaks. By the Middle Ages, a nationalized police force had emerged in France, though made as an effort to protect the monarchy from revolt than to protect the citizens from crime. Maintaining the existing order was the only priority. Civil liberties were of little concern. The English tradition was different. Because of its isolation, England was relatively more stable than continental Europe during the Dark and Middle Ages. It didn't face the constant threat of revolution. Ruling regimes in other parts of Europe had to maintain order by suppressing dissent and keeping the public from posing a threat to them. In Britain, preserving order meant protecting lives, rights, and property from thieves, vandals, and murderers. Consequently, the English benefited from an orientation toward local rather than centralized policing. Before the Norman conquest of 1066, Britain was organized into tithings, groups of about 10 families in a given geographical area who were expected to maintain peace and order on their land. If a member of a tithing committed a crime, the group was expected to turn the transgressor over to the king, or the tithing would be punished as a group. Groups of 10 tithings were then grouped into larger units called shires. To keep order in the shires, the crown appointed a representative called a reeve, a position usually filled by one of the shire's own residents. The position came to be called the shire reeve, the source of our modern word sheriff. This mix of incentives for tithings enabled them to maintain order with a balance of liberty and accountability. The English system also benefited from its adherence to common law rather than Roman law. Because the objective of common law is dispute resolution rather than enforcing the will of the sovereign, it offers more protection of individual rights. English citizen ability to sue law enforcers who violated their rights was unheard of in countries with centralized policing forces. English trials were also governed by sets of procedure, again in stark contrast to the rest of Europe. Some of that began to change after the Norman conquest. The Normans used the existing traditional English structure to impose a more centralized system like those on the continent. Sheriffs became more beholden to the crown, and the Normans introduced the position of constable, which would come to replace the sheriff as the crown preferred local law enforcement officer. Still, while the Normans made some important changes to the way British society kept order, the tradition of common law rule, trials with set procedures and individual rights was too ingrained to be overcome. As with Imperial Rome and Italy in the modern ages, urbanization in England eventually created the need for a new system. By the 14th century, as England grew more populous and industrialized, the tithing system grew less useful. Social pressure lost its effectiveness in keeping order as English citizens came to live closer together, next to neighbors they didn't already know. In response, Parliament authorized the position of urban constable to keep order. Constables were permitted to draft citizen watchmen to patrol city streets at night and raise the hue and cry to call up all men between ages 15 and 60 in the event of an emergency. By the early 18th century, England, and London in particular, had thoroughly outgrown its antiquated system of preserving order. London at the time held 10% of the country's population within its city limits. The streets, overrun with highwaymen, pickpockets, and burglars, were growing more dangerous. The constables and their deputies were overworked and easily corrupted. In more affluent areas, magistrates could afford to hire thief-takers, freelance crime fighters who would capture crooks in exchange for a bounty. But crime persisted, and British officials would soon be forced to look for a better solution. The American experience was shaped by the lessons from the classical period. The Enlightenment ideas about the proper relationship between the people and the state by English common law and, of course, by the colonists' direct experience with British rule. Among the most crucial concepts inherited from these traditions was a term that has since lost a great deal of its original meaning, the castle doctrine. When used today, the term is most often associated with the gun control debate, but it means a great deal more to the impulses that shaped our national ideas about privacy, liberty, and the proper relationship between the individual and the state. Ironically, America both inherited the castle doctrine from British common law and was moved to revolution in part by Britain's refusal to honor the principle in the colonies. Put simply, the castle doctrine holds that a man's home is his castle. But it springs from an older, much broader sentiment that the home should be protected as a place of refuge, peace, and sanctuary. One of the earliest recorded pronouncements of the idea came from the Roman statesman Cicero. More Roman. What more sacred, what more strongly guarded by every holy feeling than a man's own home? Implicit in the sentiment is not only the right to repel criminal intruders, but also the idea that the state is permitted to violate the home's sanctity only under limited circumstances, only as a last resort, and only under conditions that protect the threshold from unnecessary violence. Thus, before entering without permission, government agents must knock, announce, and identify themselves, state their purpose, and give the occupants the opportunity to let them in peacefully. The castle doctrine establishes the home as a sanctum in which a citizen can expect to be left alone, a principle that the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis called the most comprehensive of rights, the right most valued by civilized men. The castle doctrine was probably first formally invoked in common law in Semane's case, 1572, has been a right recognized and protected by British law ever since. In 1762, the barrister and English legal scholar William Hawkins wrote, "Where one lies under a probable suspicion only, and is not indicted, it seems the better opinion at this day that no one can justify breaking open doors in order to apprehend him." Even among those commentators on English law who thought the king could break into a private home, it was generally accepted that he could do so only after knocking, announcing, and giving the residents time to grant entry and avoid violence. The 17th century English judge and barrister Matthew Hale wrote, "But the breaking of an outer door is, in general, so violent, obnoxious, and dangerous a proceeding that it should be adopted only in extreme cases where an immediate arrest is requisite." The 1757 English trial of Richard Curtis litigated castle doctrine principles that would resurface in drug-related cases in the United States 2 centuries later. Curtis was charged with the murder of a sheriff who had come to his home with an arrest warrant and forced entry without first announcing himself. In his defense, Curtis argued that he had no way of knowing that the man breaking into his home was an officer of the law. The court sided with Curtis, ruling that peace officers could break open a door The court sided with Curtis, ruling that peace officers could break open a door only after having demanded admittance and given due notice of their warrant. The subject of the warrant had to be given notice that the officer cometh not as a mere trespasser, but claiming to act under proper authority. The announcement requirement under English law was not a formality, as it has become in police raids carried out today. It was elemental. Its purpose was to give the homeowner the opportunity to avoid violence, distress, and the destruction of his property. A quick knock, an announcement in the middle of the night, followed by forced entry 10 to 15 seconds later, before anyone inside can wake, come to the door, and peacefully grant the sheriff entrance, would be only slightly less offensive to the doctrine's spirit than not knocking at all. As we'll see, while the U.S. Supreme Court still recognizes the castle doctrine, thanks to the modern drug war, the court has all but abandoned this idea that the doctrine should protect homeowners from unnecessary violence, which has historically been the entire reason for its existence. Not all English legal traditions were carried on in the United States, of course, but the evidence of the founders' reverence for the castle doctrine is overwhelming. When English authorities began to trample on the principle, the colonists were first moved to protest, then to try to protect themselves through their own courts and legislatures, and finally to openly revolt. The real confrontation started in 1760 when England instituted a battery of unpopular taxes and imported restrictions on the colonies. Many colonists took to smuggling to avoid paying new taxes on imported goods. The British then responded with heavy-handed laws to move against the smugglers. Then, as now, the authorities were required to get warrants before searching private property. But it was the general warrant that infuriated the colonists. General warrants lack specificity. They grant broad authority to search broad groups of people, the evidence of any number of crimes, sometimes over long stretches of time. The variety of general warrant that Britain used to enforce the import and tax laws on the colonists was called the writ of assistance. The policy had been authorized by the British Parliament in the 1660s, but it was rarely used in England. Beginning in the 1760s, however, it became an effective way to combat smugglers and tax scufflaws in the colonies. Writs of assistance gave customs officials the power to enter private homes, search for smuggled or untaxed goods, and command other government officials and even private citizens to assist them. In some ways, the writs were less intrusive than today's drug warrants. Writs could not be exercised at night, for example, and authorities still had to knock, announce, and allow sufficient time for residents to grant them entrance before breaking down a door. But in other ways, writs of assistance granted government officials more sweeping powers than any warrant today. A writ holder had the power to search any building or residence and confiscate any suspected contraband, and once issued, a writ was essentially permanent. It remained valid until 6 months after the death of the king in power, when it was issued. The colonists despised the writs, particularly in port cities like Boston, the hub of revolutionary fervor. The Massachusetts legislature banned general warrants in 1756, but the prohibition didn't stop the English from issuing and enforcing them. Aggrieved Bostonians soon found a champion in James Ortiz, Jr., a blustery Boston attorney who had just resigned as Advocate General of the Admiralty Court, the court with jurisdiction over the ships importing goods, in protest against the abuses brought by the writs. When Otis resigned, began advocating against the writs, and offered free legal representation to anyone who wanted to challenge their legality, he attracted attention in both Boston and London. In 1761, Otis agreed to represent a group of prominent Boston merchants challenging the writs in Paxton's case. The case was likely to be a loser. British law was fairly settled on the matter, but Otis and the plaintiffs hoped to use the case to stir up opposition. When the trial came, Otis used the court proceedings as his platform to deliver an impassioned, wide-ranging, 5-hour polemic against the practice of general warrants. In one passage he called writs of assistance the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. Otis invoked natural rights, the Magna Carta, and the Castle Doctrine. Now, one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. Custom house officers may enter our homes when they please. We are commanded to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way, and whether they break through malice or revenge, no man, no court can inquire. Bare suspicion without oath is sufficient. As expected, Otis lost in court, but his speech likely changed the course of history. One member of the courtroom audience that afternoon was John Adams, a 25-year-old lawyer who would become the second president of the United States of America. Later in his life, Adams recalled the impact that Otis's speech had on him. He praised Otis's grasp of history and fiery defense of the rights of man, and pointed out that quite ahead of his time, Otis even declared that black men should be afforded the same rights as white men, including the right to own property. Adams credited Otis and his diatribe against British warrant abuses as the first knocks of the American Revolution. Every man of an immense crowded audience appeared to me to go away as I did, ready to take arms against writs of assistance, Adams wrote. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born. Writs of assistance and the customs bureaus that carry them out would be among the first specific complaints that the signers of the Declaration of Independence laid out against King George III on July 4th, 1776. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. In 1791, the Castle Doctrine was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution when the Fourth Amendment was ratified with the rest of the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment prohibits general warrants at the federal level. The prohibition would later be extended to the states through the 14th Amendment, by requiring that laws not be issued without reason and probable cause, and they be sworn with an oath and affirmation, and that they include particular information about the place to be searched and the person and items to be seized. But the Fourth Amendment was just one part of a larger, ongoing debate about how to police and defend the security of a free society. The country was young, untested, and unstable, and it faced hostile threats, both internal and external. Those threats would test early America's devotion to individual rights and the Enlightenment principles that had animated the fight for independence. Well, the first chapter takes us from Rome to writs, which like Rome to England, and about the Castle Doctrine and how a man's home is his castle, which, had to do with warrants and okay. how it evolved, how policing and warrants evolved. We are way past that now, it seems. We have no-knock warrants, and I don't know if generalized warrants have become a thing. Warrants do need to be specific. If they come for guns, they gotta pick out guns. All right. Did you want to read? Do you want that? Is that chair more comfortable? This chair sucks. Okay. What? Yeah, all lives matter. Yeah, fuck that shit.
Black, white,
No.
Mexican, Puerto Rican, they do.
No.
We our kids though. We belong to God. We all matter.
What you out here for?
Period.
There is no God.
Oh, really?
I won't say
Yeah.
that. I'm sorry.
What you believe in?
Oh, I believe in.
You just here to be here?
Yeah. What do you believe in?
I believe in something way better than what we got going on.
Oh, I believe that. For sure.
My God is different from your God.
There is no God.
What is it, make-believe?
Make believe. No, reality.
Reality?
Yeah, here we are.
So we be made, huh?
No, you think we were made.
Huh?
You think we were made by God, right?
No, we weren't made by God.
No?
No.
No, we evolved.
Right, from what? From the ground? From
No.
the sky?
No, from previous beings. You know, we started out as protozoa, one single-celled organisms.
So you believe in something?
Okay, we are reading Rise of the Warrior Cop, the Militarization of America's Police Force. And we are on Chapter 2, Soldiers in the Streets. One of America's greatest strengths is that the military is responsive to civilian authority, and that we do not allow the Army, Navy, and the Marines and the Air Force to be a police force. History is replete with countries that allowed that to happen. Disaster is the result. That's a quote from Marine Lieutenant General Stephen Olmsted in his 1987 testimony before the U.S. Congress. The Third Amendment reads in full, No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. You might call it the runt piglet of the Bill of Rights amendments, short, overlooked, and sometimes the butt of jokes. The satirical news site, The Onion, once mocked it with an article about a Third Amendment advocacy group and its perfect 191-year fight to keep the amendment intact. The group's motto, keep the fat hands of soldiers out of America's larders. The Supreme Court has yet to hear a case that turns on the Third Amendment, and only one such case has reached federal appeals court. There have been a few periods in American history when the government probably violated the amendment and on a large scale, but those incursions into quartering didn't produce any significant court challenges. In the War of 1812, for example, federal troops were quartered in private homes by the thousands, and quartering was also widespread during the Civil War. On both occasions, the quartering was neither authorized nor prescribed by Congress. During World War II, U.S. military forces stationed themselves in the homes of Aleutian Islanders in preparation for an anticipated attack by Japan. Though it's likely that the government overstepped its authority in all of these instances, they failed to produce any work for the Supreme Court to hash out the amendment's protections and exceptions. Not surprisingly, then, Third Amendment scholarship is a thin field comprising just a handful of law review articles, most of which either look at the amendment's history of pontificate on its obsolescence. Given the apparent irrelevance of the amendment today, we might ask why the farmers found it so important in the first place. Why the framers found it so important in the first place. After all, citizens were made to sacrifice for national defense in ways far more intrusive. The Constitution allows for conscription, for example, and the Continental Army openly seized property like livestock and food from colonists. Why then was quartering so despised? One answer returns to the castle doctrine. If you revere the principle that a man's home is his castle, it hardly seems just to force him to share a portion of it with soldiers, particularly when the country isn't even at war. But the historical context behind the Third Amendment shows that the framers were worried about something more profound than fat soldier hands stripping the country's larders. The amendment was a placeholder for the broader aversion to an internal standing army. At the time the Third Amendment was ratified, the images and memories of British troops in Boston and other cities were still fresh, and the clashes with colonists that drew the country into war still evoked strong emotions. What we might call the symbolic Third Amendment wasn't just a prohibition on peacetime quartering, but a more robust expression of the threat that standing armies posed to free societies. It represented a long-standing, deeply ingrained resistance to armies patrolling American streets and policing American communities. And in that sense, the spirit of the Third Amendment is anything but anachronistic. As with the castle doctrine, colonial America inherited its aversion to quartering from England. British opposition to the practice dates back to the decade after the Norman conquest, when King William first stationed a permanent army in England for national defense. To raise soldiers for an army, subsequent kings would often pardon killers and thieves, conscript them into military service, then billet them in towns and cities. As you might imagine, giving criminals weapons and the authority of soldiers, then billeting them among the population, brought some problems. Opposition to quartering persisted for centuries, culminating with a ban on the practice in the English Bill of Rights signed by William and Mary in 1689. Excuse me. Appreciation of the problems associated with putting soldiers among the citizenry ultimately carried over to the New World, just as the Castle Doctrine did. And as the Castle Doctrine, England wasn't nearly as respectful of the principle in the colonies as it was at home. The first significant escalation of the issue came in the 1750s, when the British sent over thousands of troops to fight the 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War. In the face of increasing complaints from colonies about the soldiers stationed in their towns, Parliament responded with more provocation. The Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonists to house, feed, and supply British soldiers, albeit in public facilities. Parliament also helpfully provided a funding mechanism with the hated Stamp Act. Protest erupted throughout the colonies, both in the streets and in the legislatures. Some protests spilled over into violence, most notably the Boston Massacre in 1770. England only further angered the colonists by responding with even more restrictions on trade and imports, the laws that customs officials used general warrants to enforce. Parliament then passed a second Quartering Act in 1774, this time specifically authorizing British generals to put soldiers and colonists home. There were no wars going on at this time. The law was aimed squarely at correcting the colony's insubordination. England then sent troops to emphasize the point. It was the deployment of British soldiers to colonial cities strictly for the purpose of enforcing the law that set long smoldering hostilities aflame. Using general warrants, British soldiers were allowed to enter private homes, confiscate what they found, and then keep the bounty for themselves. The policy was reminiscent of today's civil asset forfeiture laws, which allow police to seize and keep for their departments cash, cars, luxury goods, and even homes, often under only the thinnest allegation of criminality. Quartering itself, the specific burden of giving up a bed to a soldier, feeding him and clothing him, was not what edged cities like Boston to the brink of war. The actual quartering of British troops in the private homes of colonists was rare, at least up until the start of the American Revolution. It was the predictable fallout from positioning soldiers trained for warfare on city streets among the civilian population and using them to enforce laws and maintain order that enraged colonists. Contemporary newspaper accounts documented frequent and increasingly bitter altercations between soldiers and citizens. Bostonians were British subjects, but they were being treated like enemies of the state. They began to interpret the stationing of troops in their city as an act of war. After the American Revolution, the leaders of the new American Republic had some difficult decisions to make. They debated whether the abuses that British soldiers had visited upon colonial America were attributable to quartering alone or to the general aura of militarism that came with maintaining standing armies in peacetime, and whether restricting, prohibiting, or providing checks on either practice would prevent the abuses they feared. Anti-Federalists like George Mason, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, and Elbridge Gerry opposed any sort of national army. They believed that voluntary civilian militias should handle issues of national security. To a degree, the Federalists were sympathetic to this idea. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison had all written on the threat to liberty posed by a permanent army. Even Alexander Hamilton, the most Federalist of the Federalists, presciently warned about the temptation to sacrifice liberty at home for security from outside threats. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations the most attached to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. But the Federalists still believed that the federal government needed the power to raise an army. Those same liberties faced a greater threat from outside forces and were likely to be obliterated entirely if the young nation was conquered by a foreign power. In the end, the Federalists won the argument. There would be a standing army. But protection from its potential threats would come in an amendment contained in the Bill of Rights that created an individual right against quartering in peacetime. Even during wartime, quartering would need to be approved by the legislature, the branch more answerable to the people than the executive. Taken together, the Third, Second, and 10th Amendments indicate the founders' desire for the power to enforce laws and maintain order to be primarily left with the states. As a whole, the Constitution embodies the rough consensus at the time that there would be occasion when federal force might be necessary to carry out federal law and dispel violence or disorder that threatened the stability of the Republic, but that such endeavors were to be undertaken cautiously and only as a last resort. More importantly, the often volatile debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists showed that the Third Amendment itself represented much more than the sum of its words. The amendment was in some ways a compromise, but it reflects the broader sentiment shared by both sides about militarism in a free society. Ultimately, the founders decided that a standing army was a necessary evil, but that the role of soldiers would be only to dispel foreign threats, not to enforce laws against American citizens. Before the Bill of Rights could even be ratified, however, a rebellion led by bitter veteran tested those principles. A bitter veteran tested those principles. Daniel Shays was part of the Massachusetts militia during the Revolutionary War. He fought courageously at Bunker Hill, Lexington, and Saratoga. He was wounded in action and received a decorative sword from the French General Lafayette in recognition of his service. As the war ended, Shays returned to his farm in Massachusetts. It wasn't long before he began receiving court summonses to account for the debts that he had accumulated while he was off fighting the British. Shays went broke. He even sold the sword from Lafayette to help pay for his debts. Other veterans were going through the same thing. They were broke, often wounded from battle, and getting little help from the country they'd just fought to create. The debt collectors weren't exactly villains either. Businesses, too, had taken on debt to support the war. They set about collecting those debts to avoid going under. Shays and other veterans attempted to get relief from the state legislature in the form of debtor protection laws or the printing of more money, but the legislature balked. In the fall of 1786, Shays assembled a group of 800 veterans and supporters to march on Boston. They planned not only to close down the courthouses to prevent them from foreclosing on the veterans' farms, but also to forcibly free debtors from prison. The movement subsequently succeeded in shutting down some courtrooms, and some began to fear that it threatened to erupt into a full-scale rebellion. In January of 1787, Massachusetts Governor James Bowdoin asked the Continental Congress to raise troops to help put down the rebels, but under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government didn't have the power to provide that sort of assistance to the states. So Bowdoin instead assembled a small army of mercenaries paid for by some creditors who were hounding men like Shays. After a series of skirmishes, the rebellion was broke by the following summer. Shays' rebellion was never a serious threat to overthrow the Massachusetts government, much less that of the United States, and it was put down relatively quickly, without the use of federal troops and with little loss of life beyond the rebels themselves. But its success in temporarily shutting down courthouses in Boston convinced many political leaders in early America that the country needed a stronger federal government. Inadvertently, Shays spurred momentum. For what became the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The impact of Shays' rebellion didn't end, however, at Philadelphia. Memories of the rebellion and fears that something like it could stabilize the new republic blunted memories of the abuses suffered at the hands of British troops and made many in the new government more comfortable with the use of federal force to put down domestic uprisings. In 1792, just a year after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, Congress passed the Calling Forth Act. The new law gave the President the authority to unilaterally call up and command state militias to repel insurrections, fend off attacks from hostile American Indian tribes, and address other threats that presented themselves while Congress wasn't in session. In addition to the concerns raised by Shays' rebellion, growing discontent over one of the country's first federal taxes, a tax on whiskey, was also making the law supporters anxious. The Calling Forth Act allowed the President to federalize and deploy the militia whenever the laws of the United States shall be opposed or the execution thereof obstructed in any state by combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings or by the powers vested in the marshals by this act. 2 years later, in 1794, President George Washington used the act to call up a militia to put down the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. The Calling Forth Act did expand the power of the executive, and Washington's willingness to invoke it showed that the new government wouldn't hesitate to use an armed force on its own citizens when faced with a violent uprising. But the law still authorized the president to call up such a force only in dire situations, and then only long enough to dispel the threat. That power would be further regulated in 1807 with the Insurrection Act, which clarified that the president could call up the military to put down a rebellion only if so requested by a state. He could send in the military in spite of a state's wishes only if he determined that the situation was so dire that federal law could no longer be enforced, or if the basic rights of the state citizens were being violated and the state couldn't or wouldn't do anything about it. The Insurrection Act, which stipulated that the military was to be used only as an absolute last resort, would be used in subsequent decades to put down slave rebellions and prison riots. So ideas about law and order were already evolving. The young republic had gone from a country of rebels lashing out at the British troops in their midst to a country with government unafraid to use its troops to put down rebellions. But American presidents had still generally adhered to the symbolic Third Amendment. For the first half-century or so after the ratification of the Constitution, military troops were rarely, if ever, used for routine law enforcement. But that would soon change. Excuse me. On April 8, 1851, Charles Loring stood up in a Boston courtroom to deliver his closing argument. He had represented his client for only a few days, but the man's freedom hung in the balance. Outside the courtroom, federal marshals, militia, and Boston constables and watchmen stood guard. Iron chains blocked all entrances to the building. 4 days earlier, Thomas Sims, a 17-year-old escaped slave, had been arrested in the free state of Massachusetts. Sims had escaped the Savannah plantation of John Potter, one of the city's wealthiest farmers. Sims then stowed away on a freight ship which brought him to Boston. Sims had been arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act, passed the year before as part of the Compromise of 1850, a package of bills aimed at ameliorating the growing tensions between free and slave states. An earlier Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1793, already prohibited citizens from aiding the escape of slaves and mandated their return to their masters. But as slavery fell out of favor in the North, many cities and towns became places of refuge for freed slaves. State legislatures in the North began passing laws that made it easier for escaped slaves to win their freedom. The 1850 law was passed to plug the holes that had subsequently been poked in the law passed a half-century earlier. Even for its time, it was an outrageous piece of legislation. Any black person in a free state could be claimed as an escaped slave on little more than the word of a Southerner claiming to own him. The accused would then be arrested and given a hearing, not a jury trial, in front of an appointed federal commissioner, not a judge. Denied habeas corpus, the alleged slave was neither permitted to testify on his own behalf nor allowed to personally challenge the word of the man who claimed him as his property. The commissioner's decision could not be appealed. Anyone aiding a slave's escape, even by merely offering him food or water, was guilty of a federal offense, punishable by a $1,000 fine and 6 months in prison. Not only were federal marshals paid bounties for capturing escaped slaves, they could be fined $1,000 if they refused to arrest a black person whom any white person claimed was a slave. As if all that weren't enough, the appointed commissioners who decided the fates of the accused were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of the slave owner, but just $5 if they ruled in favor of the alleged slave. Wow. The law was so skewed toward slave owners that even blacks who had been free all their lives were at risk of being consigned to slavery by false accusations. The Sims case attracted national attention among opponents of slavery. When Sims was ordered back to the plantation, prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Lloyd Garrison, and Henry David Thoreau wrote enraged polemics condemning the farcical proceedings, but most of Boston was complacent. The prospect of a civil war was daunting. For the time being, many in the North were willing to tolerate slave catching as the price was for avoiding bloodshed. Yeah. I'm sorry? We're on Facebook Live. Yeah. We're reading Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police force. What?
What do I go to?
Go to May 30th Alliance.
May 30th.
Yep. I'm sorry. Let's see here. The prospect of a civil war was daunting. For the time being, many in the North were willing to tolerate slave catching as a price for avoiding bloodshed, at least bloodshed by people other than slaves. 3 years later, the mood had changed, and Boston was again the site of a fugitive slave hearing. 19-year-old Anthony Burns had escaped to Boston from an estate in Richmond, Virginia. He was working for a clothier when he was apprehended on May 24, 1854, by slave catcher Asa O. Butman, who arrested him under the pretext of a jewelry store robbery. On the morning of Burns' hearing, armed abolitionists, calling themselves the Vigilance Committee, forced their way into the courtroom with a battering ram. In the ensuing melee, a federal marshal was killed. The rescue was unsuccessful, and the rescuers were arrested, but the event captured Boston's attention and the country's. When Burns' hearing resumed the next day, thousands of people came out to protest. Boston Mayor J.V.C. Smith called up 2 companies of the Massachusetts militia to keep order for the remainder of the hearing. Finding those forces inadequate, he then contacted President Franklin Pierce directly to request the 2 U.S. Army battalions and 50 Marines be sent to Boston. During his 1852 campaign, Pierce had vowed more robust enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, so when Smith asked for troops, Pierce consented. He had also put hundreds more troops on standby just in case Smith needed them. By the end of the week, the hearing still wasn't over. Because Burns would have to be kept in Boston over the weekend, the troops had to stay there too. The protests grew, as did tensions between the troops and the protesters. On June 2, 1854, Slave Commissioner Edward G. Loring, a double cousin of the man who had defended Thomas Sims, ordered Anthony Burns returned to Virginia. Some 50,000 Bostonians poured into the streets and took to rooftops in protest. Some flew American flags upside down, and others shouted, "Kidnappers!" at the police and soldiers. One group hoisted a coffin under a banner that read, "The Funeral of Liberty." The city was angry, as much at the law as at the amount of force their own state officials had brought to bear to enforce it. The moment Loring issued his decision, Boston went into lockdown. The troops fired cannons in the air as a warning to the protesters. The mayor declared martial law, probably illegally. Over the next several hours, U.S. soldiers and state militiamen cleared the streets of Boston. On several occasions, the militiamen fired into the crowd. When the troops mistook a crowd surge for an assault, they charged the protesters with bayonets. There were numerous injuries, a few of them serious, but somewhat miraculously there was no fatalities. Once the streets were cleared, another group of troops marched the prisoner from the courthouse to the steamship waiting for him at the docks. From Boston Harbor, the site of the Boston Tea Party, the ship and the federal troops aboard it took Anthony Burns back to Virginia, from a city nicknamed the Cradle of Liberty to the shackles awaiting him in Richmond. It hadn't yet been 100 years since the Boston Massacre, in which the British soldiers fired first into the air, then directly into the mob of angry protesters, effectively sparking the American Revolution. Yet on the morning of June 2, 1854, it was U.S. soldiers who who lined Boston's streets, who fired shots from a cannon positioned in the town square as a warning to fellow Americans, and who used the threat of a military force to silence the speech of American citizens. The reason for the protests, that a man who had escaped the yoke and found refuge in the arms of a free state was being sent back into bondage, only compounded the poignancy of the scene. The heavy-handed response and arresting imagery of federal troops imposing martial law on an American city was bad enough. But Anthony Burns' affair also brought about a new and significant breach of the symbolic Third Amendment. Like Franklin Pierce, who had appointed him, U.S. Attorney General Caleb Cushing was a doughface, a Northerner with Southern sympathies. He had been looking for an occasion to strengthen enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, as his boss had promised in the campaign. In response to the vigilantism and public backlash in Boston, he issued what became known as the Cushing Doctrine. The policy allowed U.S. Marshals to call up the military to help them enforce federal law without explicit authorization from either the President or the Congress. Prior to the Cushing Doctrine, when a U.S. Marshal needed a posse, he typically drew it from the men in his jurisdiction. If he needed backing from the military, he had to get authorization from the President. The difficulty of obtaining that authorization made such requests rare. The Cushing Doctrine made it easier. Calling on federal troops to use force against American citizens had been reserved for insurrection or rebellion, but now there was a new criterion. A single marshal could call up troops merely if he felt that people were preventing him from performing his duties. The opinion would be used to hunt down fugitive slaves in northern states where the Fugitive Slave Act was unpopular, to put down John Brown's anti-slavery revolt at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and to enforce federal law on the relatively lawless western frontier. A major barrier had come down. The federal military could now be routinely used to enforce federal law. And it happened not by way of a conventional amendment or a constitutional amendment, or a vote from elected Congress, or even a Supreme Court decision, but after an opinion issued by a U.S. Attorney General. The next challenge to the symbolic Third Amendment came after the Civil War during Reconstruction. The federal government stationed U.S. troops throughout the southern states to protect ex-slaves from retribution and to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the Reconstruction Act. By most any definition, the troops were an occupying force. Performing or closely overseeing nearly all government functions in the former Confederacy. The mass deployments of troops in the South were made possible by a series of laws called Force Acts. The first law, passed by Congress in 1870, made it a federal crime to use threats, force, intimidation, or bribery to keep someone from voting based on race or prior status as a slave. It was basically the enforcement mechanism for the 13th Amendment. The second law, passed in 1871, allowed for federal oversight of elections if 2 or more citizens in any town of more than 20,000 people requested it. The third law, also passed in 1871, is sometimes called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It gave the federal government sweeping authorization to use the military against any group suspected of conspiring against federal law. The law also made the terror and intimidation tactics used by white supremacist groups a federal offense, and authorized the president to suspend habeas corpus if, in his judgment, other efforts to suppress race-related terror and violence weren't working. As long as the troops were in place, Reconstruction worked. The federal presence prevented state and local officials in the former Confederate states from denying blacks the right to vote, barring them from holding public office, or consigning ex-slaves to indentured servitude. The troops also helped prevent mob violence and lynching, although both still happened. But the disputed presidential election of 1876 put an end to all that. No candidate won a majority of electoral votes, so the election was decided by a backroom deal between Republican and Democratic leaders. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes emerged as the president-elect in a deal that required him to pull federal troops out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 brought in a new era of mob violence, systemic discrimination, segregation, and general second-class status for blacks that endured for the next 80 years, essentially until the civil rights movement started accumulating victories in the mid-20th century. A little over a year after Hayes took office, Kentucky Representative J. Proctor Knott introduced an amendment to an Army Appropriations Bill to bar the enlistment of federal troops for law enforcement purposes without authorization from Congress or the President. Knott's aim was modest. He simply wanted to repeal the Cushing Doctrine. The amendment to the law, which became known as the Posse Comitatus Act, reads, "From and after the passage of this bill, it shall not be lawful to employ any part of the Army of the United States as a posse comitatus or otherwise, for the purpose of executing the laws, except in such cases under circumstances as such employment of said force may be expressly authorized by the Constitution or any act of Congress." The law's main effect was exactly what Knott intended. It nullified the Cushing Doctrine. U.S. Marshals could no longer call up U.S. troops to help them enforce federal laws unless they obtained authorization from the President. Some historians and scholars have claimed that the Posse Comitatus Act was fallout from the Compromise of 1877, and that the true aim of its supporter was to repeal Reconstruction. The suggestion is that the law is tainted by racism and sympathy for the Confederacy. There's some truth to that. The law certainly made it more difficult to enforce Reconstruction, but Reconstruction was already on the way out. It had lost support in the North. Hayes, a Republican, had even promised to end it during his campaign, and the law actually ended a policy that had been created to catch fugitive slaves. It's an unfortunate commentary on the plight of freed blacks at the time that they could be made worse off by a new policy than made worse off still by its repeal. Reconstruction was a necessary policy, and it was probably necessary to use troops to enforce it. But it was a once-in-American history sort of crisis. The deployments were authorized by acts of Congress. The 14th Amendment required the federal government to protect the rights of black Americans in the South, and it seems clear that a few hundred federal marshals weren't sufficient for the job. Reconstruction set a new bar for military involvement in domestic affairs, but there's been nothing like it since. After federal troops were pulled out of the South, the domestic deployment of U.S. troops mostly reverted back to limited situations like large-scale riots and violent insurrections. The term posse comitatus traditionally referred to the population of able-bodied men from which a posse could be drawn. Today, both the term and the law have come to represent much more than the text in Knott's amendment indicates. The law itself is now commonly misunderstood to bar the President or Congress from using the military to enforce federal or state law. That isn't quite correct. The law only prevents domestic law enforcement officials from using the military to enforce the law without authority from the President or Congress. It puts no restrictions on the Congress or the President. But more broadly, the term posse comitatus has become a signal for the principles behind the symbolic Third Amendment. It's often used today to indicate our traditional aversion to putting soldiers in the streets. Regardless of the origins of the term, the sentiment behind it has persisted, often in spite of the best efforts of elected officials. More comforting, one institution that has held the principle in especially high regard is the military itself, although here too there have been a few exceptions. By the 19th century, as America was sorting out when and how and under what conditions the military could be deployed domestically, the country was also growing. By the 1830s, U.S. cities were swelling and becoming more diverse. Predatory crime was increasingly a problem. The country needed new ideas and new institutions for maintaining day-to-day order, institutions that could be scaled to accommodate growing urbanization. Once again, the country would look to England for inspiration. All right, we're going to go on to Chapter 3, A Quick History of Cops in America. This is a quote by H.L. Mencken, Notes on Democracy. Democratic law tends more and more to be grounded upon the maxim that every citizen is by nature a traitor, a libertine, and a scoundrel. In order to dissuade him from his evil doing, the police power is extended until it surpasses anything ever heard of in the Oriental monarchies of antiquity. Colonial American towns were usually filled with people who came from the same place, worshipped at the same altar, and shared the same sense of right and wrong. Historian and criminologist Sam Walker writes, crime and sin were synonymous. An offense against God was an offense against society, and vice versa. Predatory crimes like murder, rape, and robbery were almost non-existent. Far more common were punishments for crimes like blasphemy, adultery, or drunkenness. Not surprisingly, law and policing in pre-revolutionary America more modeled fairly closely on the English example. Given the rugged conditions of frontier living and the lack of civic structures, trial and punishment were relatively rare. Moors and shared... Is that right? Okay. Mores and shared values were generally sufficient, and when they weren't, shunning and other forms of informal justice usually worked to keep civic order. Not all colonial communities were the same, and laws varied from place to place depending on the prevailing religion and tradition, but there was little need for state agents to enforce the law. Communities tended to handle transgressors on their own. There were crown-appointed sheriffs and constables, but again, they largely focused on administrative matters. As the country grew, three distinctive policing traditions began to emerge, coinciding with three regions: the Northeast, the South, and the Western frontier. In the Northeast, as the cities grew larger and more diverse in the early 18th century, their residents encountered more crime. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, early American cities first installed night watch patrols, first voluntary and then paid. The night watches were fairly successful at rounding up drunks and preventing petty infractions, but the low-paying position would prove inadequate when cities began to experience riots, mobs, and more serious crimes. The southern colonies were more agrarian and less compact and more homogeneous than the colonies of the Northeast. The primary threat to the public safety in the South, at least in the middle of whites, was the possibility of slave revolt. At least in the minds of whites was the possibility of slave revolts. As a result, the first real organized policing systems in America arguably began in the South with slave patrols. The patrols were armed and uniformed and typically had broad powers to arrest, search, and detain slaves. The slave patrols' main responsibilities were to guard against rebellions and to look for escaped slaves. They had the power to enter slave quarters at will, whether or not they had permission from the slave's owner. They could even enforce some laws against plantation owners, such as laws prohibiting the education of slaves. By the middle of the 18th century, every southern colony had passed law formalizing slave patrols. It became the primary policing system in the South. In many jurisdictions, most notably Charleston, South Carolina, slave patrols would eventually morph into the official police force. On the western frontier, early policing was more piecemeal. Northern settlers tended to congregate together and set up systems in the northern tradition, while pioneers from the south followed the southern tradition. But the expanse of the frontier didn't always accommodate either system. Often there was just too much ground to cover, and the territory was too sparsely populated. That gap was often filled by vigilantes and private police for hire. The vigilante groups came together in response to some threat to public order, then dissolved once the threat had subsided. As the name implies, they tended to operate outside the formal legal system and were naturally more prone to pop up where the legal system either didn't exist or was too weak to maintain order. In some cases, vigilante groups were better than no justice at all. In other cases, they were quite a bit worse. The first modern police force as we know it today was created in 1829 in London by Sir Robert Peel. He and his father had been pushing the idea for decades, but British concerns over the nation's civil liberties tradition had repeatedly killed the idea. Concerned about the worsening conditions in the city, Parliament finally gave its approval in 1829, but only after Peel put in place assurances and checks to retain some local control over the force and ensure that police officers' responsibilities were limited to fighting crime and protecting individual rights. His task was to convince the city that a police force would not be any army enforcing the will of a centralized power. The British police force began with 3,000 officers. They wore uniforms to make themselves recognizable, but Peel made the uniforms blue to distinguish them from the red worn by the British military. Peel was sensitive to concerns about standing armies, but he also believed that a successful police force would need at least some of the structure and discipline of a military influence. Peel appointed a retired colonel as one of his two first supervising justices. Thus, the inaugural police force took on a military-like top-down administration structure and even borrowed some military titles. It's a tradition that continues in most police departments of the United States today. Peel and his justices set out on a strict code of conduct. Officers were to avoid confrontation when at all possible. They were to be civil and polite when interacting with citizens. Most of all, Peel hammered home the principle that his police force worked for the people of London, not against them. Nevertheless, it took a while for the public to warm to the idea. Across the Atlantic and rapidly urbanizing America, larger cities began to adopt the British model, albeit with some Americanized adjustments. The first modern-style police department in the United States was established in New York in 1845. Boston and Philadelphia soon followed. New York began its experiment with 800 policemen. Fearing that London force was already too much like an army, the New York cops began their patrols unarmed and without uniforms. Early American police departments were also much more democratic than the system in London. Peel and his top aides handpicked the officers to work in London. In the United States, early police officers were nominated by ward leaders and political bosses, then appointed by the mayor. Cops were required to live in the wards they patrolled. Wow, imagine that. That's not true here. All of this tended to make early police departments more like service agencies than law enforcement bodies. Since ward leaders were elected and they found they could pressure local commanders to prioritize police deputies, Since ward leaders were elected, they found they could pressure local commanders to prioritize police duties in ways that would help get them reelected. In some neighborhoods, the police officers ran soup kitchens and homeless people were given shelter in police stations to sleep. This democratic style of policing also gave police, or more accurately, the commanders, discretion to enforce laws in ways that reflected the priorities of the communities they patrolled. Alcohol laws, for example, might be strictly enforced in one part of a city, but rarely, if ever, enforced in another. In some ways, this wasn't all that dissimilar to the way laws had been enforced before police departments existed, when transgressions within a community were handled by its members. But there were some clear drawbacks. The job of police officer had quickly become a patronage position. The only qualification for becoming a cop was a political connection. Mass firings were common when power changed hands. Can you hear that? Can you hear that? Then it's just in here. I'm sorry. Technical difficulties here. Let's see, where were we? Okay. The only qualification for becoming a cop was a political connection. Mass firings were common when power changed hands. The ethnicity of a ward's police force tended to be exclusively that of the majority of a ward's population. This could be problematic for, say, an Italian caught in a minority Irish neighborhood. Training was non-existent, beatings were common, and perhaps more importantly, the system had little effect on crime. Oh, it's not making the noise anymore. Let's see. Okay. The ethnicity of a ward's police force tended to be exclusively that of the majority of the ward's population. This could be problematic for, say, an Italian caught in a majority Irish neighborhood. Training was non-existent, beatings were common, and perhaps most importantly, the system had little effect on crime, neither preventing it nor helping to bring criminals to justice. Ironically, the more centralized, less democratic London model proved to be more protective of individual rights than early American police departments. Centralization allowed Peel to set high, consistent hiring standards based on merit. Because he was so aware of the English public's fears about violations of their civil liberties, Peel knew that the survival of his police department was probably contingent on his ability to alleviate those fears. And so by the end of the 19th century, London's bobbies, the nickname derived from Peel's name, had managed to win over the public within a couple of decades, while the reputation of the American police officer had hit bottom. With no training or standards, and with jobs based on patronage more than merit, the police in America were best known for corruption, brutality, and incompetence. Wealthy citizens looked instead to private organizations like the Pinkertons when they needed reliable security or knew of a crime they wanted solved. By the early 20th century, police reform had become a cause of the progressive movement, whose adherents saw corrupt cops as just another consequence of cities being run by political machines. There were two competing votes for reform. Progressive academics and elites wanted not only to rid police departments of patronage and corruption, but to mandate a more paternalistic role for police. They wanted cops to enforce good habits and morals among the urban poor, especially immigrants. The other voice for reform came from administrators within the law enforcement community. They too wanted to free police departments from the political machines, but they focused less on ideology and more on fighting crime. They wanted to give more freedom and autonomy to police chiefs, who were often held responsible for the actions of their officers but had very little power to actually change their behavior. In the end, the administrators won the long-term debate by embracing the concept of professionalism. Through the adoption of best practices, they successfully transformed the job of police officer from a perk of patronage to a formal profession with its own standards, a specialized knowledge, and higher personal standards and entry requirements. To be a police officer was no longer just a job. It was a career. The first 30 or so years of the 20th century saw the formation of professional societies like Police Chiefs Union, the sharing of knowledge, and police sciences like fingerprinting, and creation of specialized squads to tackle specific problems like alcohol, prostitution, and gambling. The champion of the professionalism movement was August Vollmer, who served as chief of police in Berkeley, California from 1905 to 1932. Vollmer pioneered the use of police radios, squad cars, bicycles, lie detector tests, and crime labs. As Walker writes, the professionalism movement created the modern police organization, a centralized, authoritarian bureaucracy focusing on crime control. But the morals-oriented progressives also had some victories, at least in the short term. They succeeded in passing anti-obscenity laws, and in some cities, most notably in New York, they were able to put shutting down brothels, adult bookstores, and other sex-related businesses high on the list of police priorities. Their biggest victory was, of course, the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, sale, and importation of alcohol. The amendment was enforced by the Volstead Act, passed in 1919. The prohibition of alcohol has some clear parallels with the modern drug war. Homicides spiked during Prohibition, as did public corruption. The federal government had created a lucrative new black market. In legal markets, businesses compete by providing a better product, a less expensive product, or better customer service. In black markets, they compete by warring over turf. Disputes are settled with guns, not in courtrooms. As the bootleggers obtained bigger guns to war with one another, law enforcement agencies felt that they needed bigger guns to go after the criminals. In larger cities, the ensuing arms race produced heavily armed police forces. Like today's drug prohibition, the Volstead Act was a failure. It almost certainly reduced the amount of alcohol the country consumed, but it came nowhere near stamping out booze entirely. The true believers responded by calling for tougher crackdowns and less coddling of bootleggers and drinkers. In his book, The Spirits of America, journalist Eric Burns writes that some politicians and civic leaders suggested sending drunks and booze distributors to Siberia or the South Pole. Burns noted that David Blair, a federal commissioner of Internal Revenue at the time, recommended that all American bootleggers be lined up in front of a firing squad and shot to death. Foreshadowing the cries the country would hear from drug warriors 60 years later, Henry Ford wanted the military to enforce the laws against illicit substances. Anti-alcohol activist Clarence True Wilson demanded that the Harding administration call up the Marines, arm them to the teeth, and send them to the speakeasies. Give the people inside a few minutes to depart, and if they chose not to, open fire anyhow. Wow. But as hard as the temperance activists tried, they couldn't demonize and dehumanize drinkers the way drug warriors have since succeeded in denigrating drug offenders. One likely reason was that the Volstead Act didn't criminalize the possession or consumption of alcohol, only its production and sale. So the feds could raid speakeasies, but they couldn't raid a home based on a tip that someone had a cupboard full of gin, unless they suspected there was a distillery inside. Since simply ingesting alcohol was not a criminal act, it was more difficult for Prohibition supporters to cast drinkers as villains. The country was also more federalist in the 1920s. Even after the 18th Amendment passed, some states, cities, and countries simply refused to enforce it. After the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the professionalism model returned to police departments. Although some of the aims of professionalism may have been noble, the story of early American policing is one of overcorrection. While the professionalism reformers were able to end the patronage system, in some cities they managed to insulate police departments from politics altogether, making it difficult for mayors and city councils to hold police officials accountable. At the level level of individual cops, the use of squad cars and radios clearly brought a lot of benefits, but could also isolate police officers from the residents of the communities they patrolled. Cops out walking beats could chat with citizens, form relationships, and become part of the community. Squad cars gave cops a faceless and intimidating presence. They tended not to get out of them except in the event of problems or confrontations. Police and citizens interacted only when police were ticketing or questioning someone, or when a citizen was reporting a crime. In poorer communities, that could bring about increasingly antagonistic relationship between cops and the citizens on their beats. Perhaps no police chief better illustrated that double-edged sword of the professionalism than William Parker in Los Angeles. Parker took over the LAPD in 1950 and imposed a rigid, hierarchical, militaristic bureaucracy. He took on corruption in the department successfully and stressed efficiency and crime fighting above all else. Parker had also worked in public relations for the military for a time, and he used that experience to sell his ideas about policing to the public. He helped create the show Dragnet, a virtual commercial for Parker-style police management, or at least an idealized form of it. But Parker also loathed community policing, the idea that cops could have a stake in the communities they served. He preferred to have a wall between cop and community. That sentiment probably stemmed from the goal of ridding the department of the sort of localized interest that existed in the patronage era. But completely walling off cops from their communities presented its own problems. Making cops indifferent to the areas they patrolled, instilling in them the notion that they were all that stood between order and anarchy. All of this could make police view the citizens in their district as, at best, the other, at worst, the enemy. Consequently, while Parker's management rid the LAPD of political patronage and corruption and instilled some needed structure and standards, he seemed oblivious to growing animosity towards police in the city's black and Latino populations. Parker's efforts at instilling professionalism provide a good seg into the age of militarization for a couple of reasons. For one, as we'll see, when the racial tensions in LA finally blew up in the form of the Watts riots, it went a long way towards scaring middle America about crime, to the point they were willing to embrace an all-out war on crime and drugs to clean up the cities. But Parker also had a much more direct impact on militarization. Shortly after taking office, the chief made a young LAPD cop barely a year into the job his personal chauffeur and eventually his protege. That set the young cop's career on a fast track. By the time of the Watts riots in 1965, Parker's young protege would take command of the city police department's response. The experience would scar him. The protege would eventually become LA's police chief himself, and in large part because of the experience in Watts, he did more to bring about today's militarized American police force than any other single person. His name was Daryl Gates. There are two forms of police militarization, direct and indirect. Direct militarization is the use of standing military for domestic policing. Indirect militarization happens when police agencies and police officers take on more and more characteristics of an army. Most of this book will focus on the latter form of police militarization, which began in the United States in the late 1960s, then accelerated in the 1980s. But the two forms of militarization are related, and they have become increasingly intertwined over the last 30 years, so it's worth looking briefly at direct militarization in the 20th century as well. As discussed in the previous chapter, direct militarization has a longer history in the United States, but has been more limited in scope. One reason may be that deploying military forces domestically usually requires a formal declaration by the President, which means such deployments have been limited to self-contained events. By the middle of the 20th century, federal troops had been deployed in response to dozens of domestic disturbances, but the incidents were highly visible, and once the crisis abated, the troops left the scene. One of the more significant policies to move the country toward direct militarization was the Militia Act of 1903, sometimes called the National Guard Act. The Anti-Federalists, remember, advocated that the country rely on state militias for national defense. That didn't work out, but the militias stayed around and were often called up by state governors to dispel less threatening uprisings. But the militias were also sometimes called into war. In fact, the 1903 law was a response to widespread sentiment that the militias had performed poorly during the Spanish-American War. The new law took what remained of the state militias and converted them into what is today the National Guard. It also established an office in the Pentagon to oversee the Guard and appropriated funds to run the office and train Guard troops. Guard units would still report to their respective states and could still be called up by their governors when needed. But if called up by the president and federalized, they wouldn't be noticeably different from the military. One legacy of the National Guard Act was to make some state governors more likely to request military help from the president and thus more reliant on the use of the military to quell disruptions. Military leaders weren't keen on this trend. They knew from history that sending soldiers to dispel citizens was usually a bad idea, and it sowed ill will towards the army among the public. The ensuing confrontations between the military and the labor protesters and strikers, anti-war activists, and other demonstrators certainly had that effect. Worse, they also sowed a certain contempt for protesters among some in the military. That sentiment, along with public anxiety about World War II and the Red Scare, fears of communists and anarchists that followed, opened up a brief period in American history when military leaders seemed more willing to intervene in domestic life than ever before. The most infamous incident came in 1932. In June of that year, 40,000 World War I veterans and their supporters descended on Washington, D.C. to demand the bonus payment they had been promised for their service. They set up camps on the Anacostia Flats, a marshy area across the river from the U.S. Capitol, and named their makeshift city Hooverville to mock President Herbert Hoover. As the bonus march began on July 28, 1932, there was an altercation in which police shot and killed 2 marching veterans. President Hoover responded by sending in the U.S. Army. 2 regiments and 6 tanks moved into the nation's capital, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur and Major George S. Patton. Major Dwight Eisenhower went along as an aide to MacArthur. The protesters initially cheered the military, thinking the troops were there to support them. Those cheers quickly turned to screams when the troops charged the protesters with guns and tear gas. While the protesters retreated back to Hooverville, Hoover ordered MacArthur to stand down. MacArthur defied the order and went after the protesters, razing the Hooverville shacks and chasing veterans, their families, and their supporters out of the makeshift towns at the points of bayonets. The sight of veterans being lied to and then bloodified by the same U.S. Army in which they had served didn't sit well with the public. Angry condemnation rang out from newspapers, civil rights organizations, and veterans across the country. The crackdown doomed Hoover's already dim prospects for re-election and turned what had been an ambivalent public firmly in support of the veterans. We don't get taught that in history class, do we? Later that year, Patton wrote a remarkable paper recounting the lessons he had learned from the bonus march. Titled Federal Troops and Domestic Disturbances, it revealed a startling contempt for free expression and for civilians in general. The paper first assesses periods of unrest throughout history. Patton ridicules nations and empires that hesitated to use violence against citizens' uprising and praises those that did. When the foolish and genial Louis XVI lost his head and the Seine ran crimson to the sea, the fault lay not with the people but with the soldiers, Patton writes. Yet less than 10 years later, Napoleon, with a whiff of grape shot, destroyed the mob and saved, only to usurp the dictatorate. Patton attributes the success of the Bolshevik Revolution to the hesitating and weak character of the Russian officers, which prevented them from properly slaughtering the communists while they were merely protesters. Most alarming are Patton's own suggestions and recommendations on how the military should handle domestic riots and uprisings. He calls the writ of habeas corpus an item that rises to plague us, and recommends shooting captured rioters instead of turning them over to the police to bring before some misguided judge who might release the rebellious citizen on a legal technicality. On establishing geographic bearings while breaking up a protest, Patton advises, it may be desirable to fly over the city to become oriented. If fired upon while in the air, reply at once with small bombs and machine gun fire. Using all caps for emphasis, he later writes, when guarding buildings, mark a dead line and announce clearly that those who cross it will be killed. Be sure to kill the first one who tries to cross it and to leave him there to encourage the others. Elsewhere he writes, if it's necessary to use machine guns, aim at their feet. If you must fire, do a good job. A few casualties become martyrs. A large number becomes an object lesson. Patton and MacArthur rose through the ranks during the first Red Scare of 1919 to 1921, when the entire country crouched in a panicked fear of radicalism. This was the era of Woodrow Wilson's Sedition Act, the 1919 anarchist bombings, and the responding raids, arrests, and deportations of thousands by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Every violent labor clash heightened fears that America was on the brink of Bolshevism. Like a number of U.S. political and civic leaders, many military leaders had soured on the notion of affording civil liberties to groups they believed were determined to overthrow the government. At a news conference after the Bonus March fiasco, for example, MacArthur showed no regret. He called the protesters a mob that was animated by the essence of revolution. He said their aim was to take out the government and that a reign of terror was being started, that without military intervention would have caused insurgency and insurrection. It was not an uncommon sentiment to the military at the time. When the U.S. Army made its basic field manual available to the public for the first time in 1935, it included a section on strategies for handling domestic disturbances. The recommendations were unsettling. The guide suggested firing into crowds instead of firing warning shots over their heads, and it included instructions on the use of chemical warfare, artillery, machine guns, mortars, grenades, tanks, and planes against American citizens. Another military manual defined democracy as a government of the masses. Results in mobocracy. Demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, anarchy. Newspaper editorials and political advocacy groups lashed out, arguing that the U.S. Army had essentially published a how-to guide for waging war on its own people. The military responded with some justification that the manuals made no mention of when or under what circumstances these tactics, which were tactics of last resort, should be used in domestic disturbances. The backlash showed that there was still an ample reserve of public support for the broader principles behind the Third Amendment. The outrage grew loud enough that in early 1936, Army Chief of Staff General Mahlon Craig retracted the manual and ordered it removed from circulation. By 1941, much of the offending language had been either removed or replaced with instructions emphasizing the use of non-lethal force. The military had overstepped, and when it was held to account, it retreated. The instructions were revised to strike a more appropriate tone, one more in line with the proper relationship with the American citizenry. World War II put an end to concerns about communists and anarchists. Protests died down, and with them the need to send troops to dispel those that got out of hand. But the period wasn't entirely calm. Racial tension mounted in some cities as black servicemen returned from the war to the same segregation, poverty, and limited opportunity they had experienced before they left. In Los Angeles, clashes between stationed Navy and Marine servicemen and the city's Latinos boiled over into the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. Riots also broke out in Detroit, Chicago, and Harlem, but only the Detroit riots required federal intervention. The first decade after the war was even quieter as the economy boomed and veterans settled down with good jobs to start families. But things were about to change. Civil rights victories would inspire revolt in the South, and the counterculture and anti-war protesters were coming. The new era began in Little Rock in 1957. The Supreme Court's 1957 in Brown versus the Board of Education animated civil rights groups and angered segregationists. When 9 black students attempted to attend classes at Central High on September 4th, Governor Orville Faubus sent Arkansas National Guard troops to prevent them from entering the building. There had been a number of incidents leading up to Little Rock in which efforts to integrate public facilities had also been met with violence. Until Little Rock, President Dwight Eisenhower had opposed sending federal troops to force integration, and he initially resisted sending soldiers to Arkansas as well. Instead, he first held a face-to-face meeting with Faubus, thinking he could convince the governor to stand down. Faubus responded by pulling the troops entirely, allowing an angry mob to force the black students to withdraw from class on September 23rd. 2 days later, Eisenhower ordered troops from the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students to school. The soldiers were soon replaced by troops from the Arkansas National Guard, which Eisenhower had federalized. Those units stayed until the end of the school year. Beginning the following year, federal courts supervised the Little Rock school system compliance with Brown versus Board of Education until 2007. Wow. Eisenhower's initial reluctance to send troops to Little Rock is often seen as a stain on his record, perhaps justifiably so, but Eisenhower had ridden alongside MacArthur at the Bonus March. In fact, he had advised MacArthur that there was something unseemly about the military's highest-ranking officer leading a charge against a citizen protest. It's possible that Eisenhower was reluctant to send troops south in 1957 because of what he saw in 1932 and the resulting public backlash. Eisenhower eventually did send troops into Little Rock because he said federal law was being flouted with impunity, and he feared that the South could slip into anarchy if something wasn't done. He waited until he felt that sending in troops was his only option. Though an argument could have been made that he waited too long, his actions also kept with the protections built into the Insurrection Act. By the 1960s, the civil rights, counterculture, and anti-war movements would be in full swing, leading the government to call repeatedly on the National Guard and occasionally on U.S. troops to keep order in urban areas. Still, the principle of keeping the U.S. military out of law enforcement remained largely intact. Despite the best efforts of too many politicians, the public still tended to recoil at the idea of putting soldiers on city streets, even for a brief time, much less for day-to-day law enforcement. That's the good news. The bad news fills most of the rest of this book. While as a nation we have mostly done a good job of keeping the military out of law enforcement, we've done a poor job, to borrow a bit of martial rhetoric, of guarding our flanks. The biggest threat to the symbolic Third Amendment today comes from indirect militarization. Instead of allowing our soldiers to serve as cops, we've turned our cops into soldiers. It's a threat that the founders didn't anticipate, that nearly all politicians support, and that much of the public either seems to support or just hasn't given much attention. No one made a decision to militarize the police in America. The change has come slowly, the result of a generation of politicians and public officials fanning and exploiting public fears by declaring war on abstractions like crime, drug use, and terrorism. The resulting policies have made those war metaphors increasingly real. Well, it looks like we're going to go into Chapter 4. The 1960s, from root causes to brute force. Democracy means that if the doorbell rings in the early hours, it's likely to be the milkman, attributed to Winston Churchill. Early in the morning of March 25, 1955, narcotics agents in Washington, D.C. arrested Clifford Reed on suspicion of distributing illegal drugs. Reed told a federal agent that he had purchased 100 capsules of heroin from Arthur Shepard, who was working for a drug dealer named William Miller. The agents recognized that they might be able to parlay a low-level arrest into a much larger bust. Reed agreed to cooperate in a controlled drug buy, and at around 3 a.m. he and a federal agent posing as a buyer gave Shepard $100 in marked bills to buy another 100 heroin capsules. Shepard took a cab to the home of Miller with the agents following, but the agent tracking Shepard lost him when he exited the cab and entered Miller's building. Afterward, D.C. City Police stopped the cab that Shepard was in and found the heroin he had just purchased, but the federal agents had failed to observe the actual drug buy. In an attempt to salvage the bust, the federal agents returned to Miller's apartment and knocked on the door. Miller said, "Who's there?" The agents responded, "Police." Miller opened the door and asked what the police wanted, but before they answered, he shut the door in front of them. The police then ripped the chain off the door and entered the apartment. They found the $100 in marked bills along with around 1,000 heroin capsules. Miller and Bessie Bird, who lived with him, were arrested and convicted on narcotics charges. The police had never obtained a search warrant. Miller appealed his conviction, arguing that the entry into his home was illegal. In 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with him. Justice William Brennan's opinion in Miller v. the U.S. was a spirited defense of the Castle Doctrine. The requirement of prior notice of authority and purpose before forcing entry into a home is deeply rooted in our heritage, Brennan wrote. It should not be given grudging application. Regrettably, Miller was effectively the last stand in defense of the home as a place of sanctuary. In the coming years, the court would uphold searches far more egregiously violative than the search performed on Miller's apartment. The first blow came 5 years later in Kerr v. California. A sergeant with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had purchased a pound of marijuana from a man named Terhagen in the parking lot of a bowling alley. Terhagen told the sergeant that his connection was Roland Murphy, who at the time was out of prison on bail pending charges for distributing marijuana. The police put Murphy under surveillance. The next day, in the parking lot of the same bowling alley, they saw Murphy parked behind a new car with a single occupant. From 1,000 feet away, at night, they saw Murphy get out of his car and converse with the driver of the new car. The officers couldn't see if anything exchanged hands between the two men. The police tried to follow the new car, but lost it when the driver made a U-turn. They checked the license plate with the State Department of Motor Vehicles and found it belonged to George Douglas Kerr. The police claimed that informants had told them in the past that Kerr was known to sell marijuana. The police then went to Kerr's address and found the car in the parking lot of an apartment building. They secured a pass key from the building manager and, without a warrant, simply walked into Kerr's apartment with no knock or announcement. Inside, they found a little over 2 pounds of marijuana. Kerr and his wife were arrested. The Kerr versus California decision was complex. By an 8-1 vote, the court concluded that the Fourth Amendment requirement that searches be reasonable applies to the states as well as federal government, and that evidence obtained in unlawful searches is inadmissible. But the court also found a 5-4 split that the search of Kerr's apartment was lawful. Writing for the majority, Justice Tom Clark found that the police had probable cause to arrest Kerr, to search his home without a warrant, and to enter his home without first knocking and announcing themselves. Clark wrote that there was a common law exceptions in the knock and announce rule known as exigent circumstances. One such exception is if police believe that a knock and announcement would result in the suspect destroying evidence. In addition to the officer's belief that Kerr was in possession of narcotics, which could be quickly and easily destroyed, Kerr's furtive conduct in eluding them shortly before the arrest was ground for the belief that he might well have been expecting the police. Clark wrote. Clark cited additional exigent circumstances as well. Police need not announce themselves if doing so would jeopardize their safety, if they are in the midst of an emergency, or if knocking would be a futile gesture, such as during the hot pursuit of a fugitive. Justice Brennan was in the minority in Kerr, and his dissent bristled with indignation. He began with a thorough history of the Castle Doctrine, even quoting James Otis. He made the point that the writus was assistance that helped inspire the American Revolution were less odious in at least a couple of ways than the search of George Kerr. Such writs could only be served in daylight hours, and they required a knock and announcement before entry. Brennan also questioned Clark's assumption that the common law provided exceptions to the knock and announce requirement. I have found no English decision which clearly recognizes any exception to the requirement that the police first give notice of their authority and purpose before forcibly entering a home, he wrote. The only exception Brennan found that was possibly in contradiction of the Castle Doctrine's intent was one allowing police to enter unannounced if they believe someone inside is in imminent danger of bodily harm. It is generally accepted today, even by critics of forced entry police raids, that officers should be allowed to enter a building or residence unannounced if the suspect is believed to be armed and likely to resist arrest if given the opportunity. After Kerr versus California, it would soon be accepted by most policymakers that police should also be exempted from the knock and announce requirement if they believe that a knock and announcement would allow the suspect to destroy evidence. The courts have since held that police may enter at the scene of a search without announcing, even with a regular warrant, if they hear or see activity inside the residence that merely suggests someone is destroying evidence. Brennan thoroughly rebuts all of those assumptions in his dissent. Though the principles he defends are backed by centuries of Anglo-American common law, his Kerr opinion was one of the last times someone as prominent as a Supreme Court justice would articulate them. His first point is that to allow an exception for the possible destruction of evidence or out of fear. Let me read that over. I'm sorry. His first point is that to allow an exception for the possible destruction of evidence or out of fear for the safety of public officers is to do obvious violence to the presumption of innocence. In fact, Brennan writes, allowing for those exceptions violates the presumption of innocence twice. First, by assuming the suspect is guilty of the crime for which he is suspected, and second, by assuming he will attempt to escape, violently confront the police, or attempt to destroy evidence if the police are required to announce themselves. Second, Brennan points out that to allow police to enter a home because they hear loud noises or running is to allow them to forcibly enter a home without announcement based on conduct that not only isn't criminal, but is ambiguous. Since the police wouldn't be permitted to prosecute someone for obstruction of justice based only on such sounds, So Brennan objected to the idea that the same sounds could be enough to allow police to enter a home without announcing. But even accepting an exception that allows the police to enter unannounced if they hear or see activity suggesting that the suspect is destroying evidence, there was no evidence of such activity in the Kerr trial record. The exception is based only on the officer's testimony that narcotic suspects often attempt to destroy evidence when they realize the police are at the door. This, Brennan notes, was enough to create an exception to the knock and announce rule for any narcotic search. Indeed, any search related to a crime involving evidence that can be easily and quickly destroyed. The recognition of exceptions to great principles always creates, of course, the hazard that the exceptions will devour the rule, Brennan writes. Brennan also touches on a number of practical problems with the repercussions of the ruling. He points out the problem of mistaken identity in criminal investigations, warning that innocent citizens should not suffer at the shock, fright, or embarrassment attendant upon an unannounced police intrusion. That was a glimpse of the hundreds of wrongdoer raids that would go down in the years to come. Brennan also points out the explicit danger that unannounced entries pose to police, writing that one common law reason for the announcement requirement was to protect the arresting officers from being shot as trespassers. Here, too, he would be proven correct in the coming decades. Dozens of police officers would be shot, maimed, and killed during unannounced raids, often by citizens who would plausibly claim they thought they were firing at criminal intruders. Those tragedies transpired because in the coming decades the court would adopt Clark's reading of the exceptions into statutes that didn't mention them, and eventually into the Fourth Amendment itself. The exception would be expanded to the point where, perversely, the court interpretation of the Fourth Amendment in regard to the knock and announce rule would put more emphasis on preserving evidence and protecting law enforcement than on the castle doctrine and protecting the home from violence. Interestingly, it's far from clear that a majority of the justices in Kerr actually backed Clark's interpretation of the castle doctrine. Although the vote was 5-4 in favor of upholding Kerr's conviction, Justice John Harlan II voted with the majority only in the outcome. Harlan didn't agree with the incorporating the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness requirement to the states. Instead, he thought the California law under which Kurz was convicted should be evaluated under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which he described as more flexible than the Fourth Amendment standard applied to federal law enforcement. Harlan didn't expressly write that the Kerr search violated the Fourth Amendment. If that was indeed what he believed, then a majority of justices believed that had the Kerr search been carried out by federal agents, it would have been unconstitutional. And a majority had already indicated that the Fourth Amendment should be incorporated to the states. That would seem to suggest that there's at least a chance that the decision in Kerr, while bad for the Kerrs, actually narrowly upheld the castle doctrine protections in Miller. But that isn't the way the decision was interpreted. When lawmakers, academics, and the media discussed and debated the knock and announce rule over the next 20 years, Kerr would be referenced as accepted law, even by civil liberties advocates. A year after Kerr, in 1964, the New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller, pushed two laws that would give police in the state sweeping new powers, the No-Knock Bill and the Stop and Frisk Bill. 9 years later, he would push through some of the most draconian anti-drug laws in the country, collectively known as Rockefeller drug laws. The No-Knock Bill allowed police to get a special search warrant authorizing them to ignore the knock and announce requirement, so long as a state judge agreed that one of the exigent circumstances that Justice Clark laid out in Kerr was present. A stop and frisk bill allowed police to stop, detain, and put down anyone in a public space whom they found suspicious. And pat down anyone in a public space whom they found suspicious. The no-knock bill passed with overwhelming support from the New York Assembly and State Senate. The stop and frisk bill passed by narrower margins. Okay, I'm going to stop here.